How did Sasori kill the strongest Kazekage, the master of the Iron Sand, the third Kazekage? This is something we know Sasori did because he turned the third Kazekage's body into a living puppet, using the latent chakra of the third Kazekage's corpse to infuse his puppet with the Iron Sand jutsu on top of all those weapons, Sasori's own poison, transforming the third Kazekage puppet into the strongest puppet ever created in an individual capacity. What he does against Chiyo and Sakura is truly remarkable, being able to use the Iron Sand to a very powerful extent. Of course, we cannot assume the third Kazekage puppet was as powerful as the third Kazekage. It would make sense for the puppet to be weaker. After all, it's no longer the living person using the jutsu. It's the latent chakra of that person in a puppet. And yes, the third Kazekage was said to be the strongest Kazekage of all time, at least by the time Gaara was captured by the Akatsuki. But we have to assume the real guy was just stronger than what we saw the puppet doing there, right? Because Sakura one-tapped that puppet. Yes, she caught the puppet off guard, and Chiyo was helping Sakura out a lot there, but we have to assume the real third Kazekage would be more powerful. And that begs the question, how did Sasori kill him? Now you may think that I'm saying this underestimating Sasori. Whoa, how did Sasori, this weak dude, kill the strongest Kazekage of all time? But that's not exactly what I'm saying here. What I'm saying is that no one knew what happened to the third Kazekage. He vanished without a trace, which plunged the Sand Village into a war with, well, we don't know who fought against the Sand Village when they lost the third Kazekage because it's never specified, but we know the village was thrown into chaos, essentially. And not knowing what happened to the third Kazekage, even more so than losing him, created this effect. Due to the fact they didn't know what happened to him, they took a long time to elect a new Kazekage and the village was left exposed. So how did Sasori do it? Capturing without warning the village whatsoever and killing him in the process. We don't know if Sasori just captured him and if he had to keep him alive to do some sort of ritual to transform him into a living puppet. And if that's the case, it's even more impressive. But the first thing we have to do is to establish the time frame of when that happened. Now, when the village elders are debating about the third Kazekage, drawing a parallel of what's happening to Gaara at that moment when he was captured by the Akatsuki, they say the third Kazekage vanished over 10 years ago. And yeah, technically the statement is not wrong, but it's definitely more than 10 years ago, significantly so. We know Gaara is about 16 at the time of the Kazekage rescue arc, and we also know that Raza, Gaara's dad, was already the fourth Kazekage by the time Gaara was born. So he had been Kazekage for at least 16 years, meaning that it had to have been over 16 years since the third Kazekage's vanishing. And if we add the fact that they took a long time to elect a new Kazekage because they expected the third Kazekage to come back somehow, so much so that they were tossed into a war according to that elder of the Sand Village, it has to have been more than 16 years, a lot more. Maybe the third Kazekage vanished about 20 years ago. I think that's a much more realistic time frame. Which, yeah, it makes that guy's statement true over 10 years, but it's twice as much. But anyway, what was Sasori doing at this point? We don't know exactly, to be fair. If we assume the third Kazekage was captured about 20 years ago, Sasori was no longer a Sand ninja at that time because he left the village 30 years ago, according to Chiyo. When she sees Sasori's face after all that time, she's like, wait, he didn't age at all after 30 years? That's just insane. And obviously it's because Sasori turned himself into a puppet. And yeah, I guess you could assume the third Kazekage vanished 30 years ago when Sasori was about to leave the village or something like that, but that wouldn't make much sense because the village wouldn't stay 10 years or so without a Kage. That seems too much to me. Then again, we also don't know when Raza took office. It was at least 16 years ago, but it could have been more. We know Raza died at 40 years old, 12 years after Gaara was born in Naruto Part 1. And we also know that Gaara at 16 was the youngest Kazekage of all time, and we don't know exactly when Gaara took office. He could have been even younger. He could have become Kazekage at 14 during the time skip. But But Raza could have become Kazekage at 18 or 20 years old, meaning that he would have been a much longer Kazekage. But still, 30 years would make Raza too young to take office, so it's likely that no, Sasori was no longer a sand ninja when he killed the third Kazekage, meaning that it wasn't a betrayal from a ninja that the Kazekage could have seen coming or something like that. And by the way the Sand Village elders tell the story, which doesn't have a lot of detail, but by the way they tell it, it feels like the third Kazekage vanished from within the Sand Village. They never say anything about him being outside of the village and then never coming back. No, they say he vanished. Kinda like how Gaara was taken away. Gaara was in the village, he was taken by the Akatsuki. The only difference is that they don't know who took the third Kazekage because his body was never found. So Sasori definitely had to infiltrate the Sand Village to do that, which honestly, it's not hard to believe, right? Sasori and Deidara literally infiltrated the Sand Village in the beginning of Naruto Shippuden, and Sasori had sleeper agents in the Sand Village, quite literally with a sleeper jutsu that awakens them to being Sasori's Bluetooth puppets, and he needed to use that jutsu on them once, so he had to infiltrate the Sand Village for that most likely, or he found them somewhere else, not in the village while they were on a mission or something, but it feels like, yeah, Sasori had been several times to the Sand Village before he comes back to it in Naruto Shippuden, and in one of those times, he did something that got himself a third Kazekage. But the thing is, he did that without ever getting found out, and also even after he turns the Kazekage into a puppet, it's weird that that information never leaks, so either Sasori never really uses the third Kazekage puppet, or every time he uses it, he definitely kills whoever saw it. So the opponent that sees the puppet dies, and therefore the information is safe. Otherwise, it's very likely this information would be spread out. Oh, that guy was using a puppet that looked a lot like the third Kazekage, and nobody in the Sand Village had a clue about that. But coming back to Sasori's killing of the Kazekage, or at least capturing of the Kazekage, the most striking fact about it is that apparently it was done in complete silence without leaving any traces. Because sure, the elders are drawing a parallel with Gaara being captured by the Akatsuki and the third Kazekage vanishing. Yes, the situation is kind of similar because the village is out of a Kazekage, which lives invulnerable and everything like that. But the situation where this happened is completely different because every single person in the Sand Village was aware that Gaara was taken away because Gaara was literally fighting against the guy that captured him above the Sand Village in one of the most flamboyant fights in the series. Deidara was using a ton of explosions. Gaara was using the entire desert to fight Deidara. There was a very conspicuous fight, to say the least. I mean, Deidara drops his C3 nuke on the Sand Village, and Gaara raises the sand shield that's the size of the village pretty much to save it. So yeah, everyone was aware of the situation there. And when you compare it to nobody knowing what happened to the third Kazekage even years after the fact, it's so different. And think about this. If they had absolutely no idea what happened, it means there were no traces left. Meaning that if there was a fight, the fight left no damage anywhere. No battle damage, nothing. And sure, Sasori is not the guy with the most explosive arsenal in the series that's gonna leave a lot of battle scars around where he fights. But still, when he fought against Chiyo and Sakura, that cave they were was completely destroyed. And yes, a lot of that damage was done by the third Kazekage puppet, and obviously he wouldn't have access to that puppet fighting against the guy that would eventually become that puppet. But the third Kazekage was fighting, and he had the Iron Sand, which had the potential to do a lot of damage, and they were large-scale jutsus. Also, are you telling me that no grains of Iron Sand were left anywhere for people to catch them and say, oh, he fought here, the third Kazekage was fighting against someone and he was taken away or something? The complete lack of any evidence and battle damage and anything indicates that there was no fight at all. Now, obviously, the third Kazekage didn't just go with Sasori because he felt like becoming a puppet. What's more likely is that Sasori laid a trap for the third Kazekage, but not in a battle sense. Because there's something else other than being a puppet master that Sasori is well known for, which is his ability to create very powerful poisons. And yes, usually we see him administering the poison during battle by either using a poison cloud or slashing the target to poison them with his puppet poisoned weapons. But being such a poison master, I don't doubt Sasori would be able to create a tasteless poison that he could poison the third Kazekage's food or drink and make sure the third Kazekage would either just die very quickly or be paralyzed if Sasori needed to take him out alive to create the third Kazekage puppet, because who knows what the process of creating a living puppet was. Maybe the person had to be living still, which is kind of gruesome, but yeah. And that makes sense, right? Sasori grows up always hearing that this guy, the third Kazekage, is the strongest ninja of their village. He would want to turn him into a living puppet more than anyone else. So he goes back to the sand village, poison his food, or maybe he ambushes the third Kazekage and just attacks him with a poison attack without him even realizing, or just when it's too late, paralyzing or killing the third Kazekage rather quickly. And if the third Kazekage even tried to react and use his iron sand against Sasori, it would be too late. Even if the jutsu were to activate, it would just be too weak to do anything against Sasori and his powerful puppets that he would already have access to at that time. And even if there was a small scuffle there, it was quick enough that Sasori would be able to erase any sort of evidence and make the sand village absolutely clueless about what happened to their Kazekage. Subscribe, ring notifications, and like the video. Those three things really help me out. Watch the video showing up on your screen next for more cool Naruto content just like this, and thank you so much for watching.